3 blind mice, and 3 who could see. So she tapped all of the mice, each one with her wand, and guess what they turned into? Horses. 3 blind horses and 3 who could see. So she put the 3 who could see at the front and the 3 blind ones behind so they could follow. So now we had a beautiful golden carriage and 6 horses to pull it, 3 of whom were blind. But she needed somebody to drive the carriage with.
The horse was the person who drove it.
The coachman.
Yeah.
So they needed a coachman. So Cinderella said, I know, I'll go to the rat trap and see what there is. So she went out and she brought back the rat trap, and they looked inside, and inside there were 3 rats. So the fairy godmother reached in and she took out the one with the most magnificent whiskers, and she tapped him with her magic wand, and it turned into a human coachman with a big bushy beard, and he sat on the coach. There's one more thing that's missing though.
The horse was
The what?
the horse was the person who carried the giraffe.
We call them the footmen. That's the people who were Cinderella's servants. Well, they hadn't got any. So the fairy godmother said, go out into the garden, and behind the water spout you'll find 6 lizards. Bring them to me. So she brought them to the fairy godmother. The fairy godmother tapped them with her wand, and they turned into 6 footmen. And they jumped upon the coach, and they were laughing and joking and chatting, and so all were ready to go. And Cinderella opened the door to get into the coach, and then she stopped.
She didn't have a dress.
She didn't have a dress. She was dressed in her rags. She said, I can't go to the ball like this, dressed in rags. Everyone will laugh at me. So the fairy godmother said, leave it to me. And she just touched Cinderella with her wand. And Cinderella's rags turned into a beautiful dress. And it was the colour of...
Pink.
It was the colour of peak. Peat or peak?
No, pink.
Oh, it was the colour of pink. Of course it was. What other colour could it be? She turned into the most beautiful pink and orange dress. She climbed into the coach and off she went. But before she went, the fairy godmother called out to her, one thing, you must make sure that you're back here by
12 o'clock.
12 o'clock, midnight. Because if you don't, all of this will vanish and you'll be back in your rags. So Cinderella agreed, and she went off to the ball. Well, as soon as she arrived at the ball, a servant ran to tell the prince that a beautiful princess had arrived, and he must come and see. And he did come and see, and he held up his hand and helped her down from the carriage. And the prince stayed by Cinderella all night and would only dance with her. Now, Cinderella was a very good person, as you know. We know that, don't we? She was a very good person. And so when she spotted her stepsisters over in the corner, she went over and sat with them and talked to them and shared all her food with them and was very, very kind to them. And they didn't know who it was. They just thought it was a beautiful princess being kind to them. So they were very excited. She was still talking to them when the clock struck 11:30. Boing! Oh, said Cinderella, it's time to go. And so she upped and she ran out of the ballroom and hopped in her carriage, and off she went. And the prince was left standing on the steps of the palace, watching her go. She got back to her house, back to the castle, and she ran into the kitchen where the fairy godmother was, and she thanked her and thanked her and thanked her, and said how beautiful the ball had been, and how she danced with the prince all night, and how she chatted to her stepsisters. And just at that point, knocking came on the door, and in came the stepsisters. Well, Cinderella yawned, and she rubbed her eyes as if she'd been asleep. And she said, you stayed so long. What was the ball like? They said, oh, the ball was magnificent. We saw the prince, and we saw the beautiful princess. And do you know, she came and talked to us, and us alone. So she must think that we are very important. And they went off laughing together. Well, the next day, The prince wanted to see this princess again, so he threw another ball. That's what princes can do, you know, because, you know, princes don't have anything else to do, so they can throw a ball whenever they want to. And so he did. The same thing happened. The fairy godmother helped our Cinderella, and she came up in her carriage. The prince held up his hand and led her out of the carriage and into the ballroom, and he danced with her all night, except for the time when she went to talk to her stepsisters, who still didn't know who she was. 11:45 came, and the clock struck. Boing, boing, boing. And Cinderella jumped up and said, "Oh, I must go." And she ran out of the palace, down into the steps, and into her carriage. And the prince was left standing on the steps, wondering where she'd gone, and if he would ever see her again. So she ran back to the house, and the same thing happened. The next day, the prince was so desperate to see the princess that he threw yet another ball. He's got so much money, he can throw parties whenever he likes. And he invited everybody. And once again, Cinderella got to go. She got into her golden carriage, and her fairy godmother tapped her dress. And this time she had such a beautiful dress that was the colour of... Oh, you're our colour man, aren't you? Go on.
Yellow.
It was the most beautiful yellow. It was as yellow as... It was as yellow as... I don't know, as yellow as...
Bright as
Gold.
the brightest yellow.
It was bright as the brightest yellow in the world. It was as bright as...
Gold. Gold.
It was as bright as gold. It was a dress that looked as though it had been spun all out of gold. And off she went to the ball. But this time, the prince was determined to catch her. So as soon as she'd gone into the ballroom and started to talk to her stepsisters, who still didn't know who she was, he got one of his servants to smear a layer of sticky tar on the steps. Now, what I didn't tell you was that the fairy godmother had given her, Cinderella, some very special shoes. And they were shoes that were made all out of glass. No one else in the world had shoes like these. And so when it came to 12 o'clock, and the clock struck 12, and Cinderella ran from the ballroom, and she ran down the steps, her shoes got stuck in the sticky tar, and one of them came off. So when she got into the carriage to go home, she only had one shoe on. And off she went home. And on the way home, the carriage turned back into a pumpkin, and the horses turned back into mice, 3 of whom were blind, and the coachman turned back into the
lizards.
the rat, big jolly rat, and the footmen turned back into lizards. And so she walked the last few yards home in only one slipper. The next day, the prince announced that he would find the girl who fit the slipper. So he sent his servants all around the countryside, looking for the woman whose foot would fit the slipper. Nobody did. Those 2 stepsisters tried and tried and tried to squeeze their feet into that slipper, but could they do it? No. It would only fit one person, and that person was their sister, Cinderella. So when Cinderella saw the slipper, and she knew it was her slipper, she said, "Let me try." Well, they all laughed at her and said, "It won't fit you. You're Cinderella. You're just a dirty servant girl. How dare you try on a slipper like this?" But the great lord who'd been sent round to make sure that everything was done properly took one look at Cinderella, and he could see that really she was a beautiful girl underneath, and that really she was the princess who'd come to the ball. So he said, "Let Cinderella try the slipper." And so she did. "Sammy, how are you doing? Come in, have a seat." And so Cinderella tried on the slipper, and it fit It fit just like a...
Glove.
Oh, just like a glove. That's the simile I was looking for. It fit just like a glove. Not only that, but Cinderella reached into her pocket and she pulled out the other one and put it on. And at that point, everybody was staring at Cinderella. They couldn't believe that this girl dressed in rags and covered in cinders was really the princess, until the fairy godmother stepped forward and she tapped Cinderella with her wand. And what happened?
Her dress turned blue.
The dress turned blue. Turned into a blue dress. As blue as the ocean. As blue as the ocean itself. In fact, this dress looked as though it had been made out of the waters of the ocean themselves. So beautiful was it. Well, the prince took one look at her and he decided that he would marry her. And so Cinderella was taken back to the palace where they were married. And everybody was invited, including the two stepsisters who'd been so nasty to Cinderella in the past. I wonder what we think should happen to them, because we can finish the story how we want. I wonder how you want the story to finish. How do you want the story to finish?
I want to end in war.
You want it to end in war. Well, at the moment, the very moment when the prince and Cinderella were married, a messenger rushed in and announced to the king that the armies of the next kingdom were amassing on the border. And so all of the soldiers and all of the knights in armour and all of the horses, they mounted up and they rode off, leaving Cinderella and the prince and the two stepsisters. And we still have to decide what's going to happen to Cinderella and the prince and the two stepsisters.
The two stepsisters get eaten.
They get eaten by the giant. So at that point they heard a great big pounding on the door, and everybody shrank back into the corner. And in came a giant. He ducked his head to get through the door, and he stood up in the room and he saw the two stepsisters and he grabbed them and he ate them up. And then he turned and went. Anyone like it to end any differently?
He throws the two stepsisters in a volcano.
Oh, he took them up the mountain and threw them into a volcano. So some of you want the stepsisters to be punished because they were so nasty. Does anybody here want Cinderella to forgive the stepsisters? Because you see, the thing is that what really happened was that Cinderella was so good and so kind that she forgave the stepsisters. And when they said, "We would love to be able to come and live in this palace with you," she said, "Of course you may, as long as you promise." They said, "What? We'll promise anything." She said, "As long as you promise to be kind." And so they made that promise. And they came to live in the palace with Cinderella. And they all lived happily ever after. So that's your story of Cinderella. What do you think?
Pretty good. I like the part.
You like which part?
I like when they get me.
I thought you would.